want to spend some time this morning thinking about two key figures in the development of rights theory, John Locke and Thomas Paine. Between them, they have decisively shaped the modern conception of rights, giving it 5 features. So here's the spoiler alert, so you're ready for your notes. Property, autonomy, individualism, choice, and equality. Locke begins his thought experiment, the social contract, by imagining what life would be like in the state of nature. If Hobbes' state of nature feels like a wilderness, Locke's state of nature appears to be populated by gentlemen farmers. It is these property-owning men who have what Locke calls natural rights, and who have to decide what limits they are prepared to accept to their natural rights in order to form a stable political community. So to take the first of my 5 themes or features of the modern conception of rights, Locke gives us a theory of rights based around the idea of property. And for him, crucially, property means that property which men have in their persons as well as their goods. So my body is something that belongs to me. So if you go to the Oude Kerk in Amsterdam, which is in the middle of Amsterdam's red light district, you walk around the back, you see one of the windows where the prostitutes are, and you have available as one of the many services you can get from prostitutes, the opportunity to buy a t-shirt which says, "My body, my choice, my rights." Well, that's just straight Lockean philosophy on a t-shirt. Now, what Locke gives us is not a theory of human rights in its modern form, but a theory of natural rights which serve the interests of a property-owning white male elite. It is human rights for rich white men. But this idea of natural rights that Locke offers becomes the modern idea of subjective human rights, rights supposedly possessed by each individual merely by virtue of being human. And the 20th century philosopher described them, H.L.A. Hart described them in these terms. Rights are typically conceived as possessed or owned by or belonging to individuals. These expressions reflect a conception of moral rules as it not only prescribing conduct, but forming a kind of moral property of individuals to which they as individuals are entitled. Rights for individuals, rights as ownership. These are the kind of things that are there in the modern conception of rights. Well, what did Screwtape make of that? We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded differences that run from my boots through my dog, my servant and my wife, my father, my master, my country, my God. They can be taught to reduce all these senses to that of my boots, the my of ownership. And all the time, the joke is that the word mine in its fully possessive sense cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls and their bodies really belong. Certainly not to them, whatever happens. So this myth of ownership is there very powerfully in the modern conception of rights. But as C.S. Lewis beautifully skews, we do not own ourselves. We are who we are because of our relationships. And as Jesus taught us when he challenged us to be prepared to give up all our closest personal relationships for his sake. Those rather uncomfortable verses in Luke chapter 14, where he says, "Whoever does not hate his mother and his father for my sake is not worthy of me." Ultimately, we belong to God. So you have this modern conception of rights which is built around the idea of property. Very different from the conception of rights offered by the Christian philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, who says that rights aren't things at all, but an aspect of our relationships. A right is always a right with regard to someone. So it's misleading to say a child has a right to education, period. A child has a right to be educated by their parents. It's an aspect of what it means for the parents to look after them. So property is one feature of the modern conception of rights. Secondly, individualism is another feature of the conception of rights. Brilliant book by Uriel Levine called The Great Debate, The Origins of Left and Right. In that book, he argues that the Enlightenment understanding of justice was individualistic. Looking at Thomas Paine, he says there's no doubt that Thomas Paine thinks that the Ancien regime in France should be got rid of because it's unjust. But his imagined criteria for a just society, his social contract, is one in which the contracting parties had gained nothing from and owed no obligations to prior generations. This isn't a reconstruction of his thought. This is what he wrote in a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1789. Imagine 20 people, each strangers to each other, meeting in an empty country. Each would be a sovereign in his own natural right. His will would be his law, but his power inadequate to his right. And then Paine goes on in that letter to describe how such people would trade freedom of protection, but without giving up their basic pre-social rights. So this is a highly individualistic understanding of the citizen. Instead of us imagining us as being born into communities that have existing traditions and benefits, and that we owe obligations of gratitude to those who've been before us and have shaped these things, instead, social and political bounds are products of individual choices driven by calculations of utility and need. So if I'm an individual, I have rights. If I can exploit them myself without the need of the state, I get on and do that. If I can't, I can draw on the power of the state to put my rights into practice. And that's not a gift of society, it's an entitlement I have. As Paine puts it in his famous book, The Rights of Man, society grants the citizen nothing. Every man is a proprietor. Property again. Every man is a proprietor in society and draws on the capital as a matter of right. Property and individualism, two concepts at the heart of the modern conception of rights. Now, I think that Locke took a wrong turn when he started his political theory with an account of natural rights given to individuals. You see, the biblical account of creation is not centered around the idea of the natural rights of individuals. It is centered around the idea of shalom. The shalom which is built into the goodness of creation, which is built into the Sabbath day rest within creation, and which is built into the great Sabbath rest at the end of history when the evil which mars this creation has been undone. Adam and Eve are created in the garden to be social beings. They are supposed to enjoy one another, to be together. And yes, it is true that God calls us into the church and calls us to himself as individuals, but he calls us into the church. He calls us into a community. Charles Malik was a Lebanese Orthodox Christian who was very, very influential in the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. He was always careful in his own thinking to talk about persons, not individuals. He wanted to emphasize the social dimension of personhood to avoid the connotation that human beings are radically autonomous and self-sufficient individuals. In 1983, Walter Storff published Until Justice and Peace Embrace. Even in that early stage in his writings on justice, he focused on shalom. In shalom, each person enjoys justice, enjoys his or her rights. There is no shalom without justice, but shalom goes before justice and beyond justice. And in a later book in 2013, Journey Toward Justice, he spends a chapter looking at the relationship between justice, love, and shalom. Shalom is not just peace, but flourishing in all dimensions of our existence, in our relation to God, in our relation to fellow human beings, in our relation to ourselves, and in our relation to creation in general. I often explain shalom like this. It's difficult for me as a British person to get a handle on shalom. I remember a time when I was speaking at a conference in Uganda, And it got to the evening, and my father and I decided we were going back to our room to go to bed. Peace and quiet is what every Brit is looking for. Couldn't get to sleep because of the noise of the Ugandans coming from the bar, having a party. The biblical picture of shalom is about the party. It's not about the peace and quiet. It's about that community where everyone is involved, where everyone is respected, where everyone is able to participate and flourish. And the individualistic conception of human rights pulls us away from that, back towards that sort of competition idea that is there. So this gives us our third feature of the modern conception of rights: autonomy. So John Locke, writing in the 17th century, his philosophy of rights becomes the de facto official philosophy for the Glorious Revolution in 1688 and the establishment of constitutional monarchy in England. But at the same time as that is happening in England, you have in France Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruling as an absolute sovereign with unlimited rights to everything in his kingdom. The old checks and balances of the medieval French monarchy had gone, and in his famous phrase, Louis XIV said, "L'État c'est moi," the state is me. It all belongs to me. I am the sovereign king with absolute power. And so what happens in the French Revolution is that flips, that the sovereign king is replaced by the sovereign individual. The French Revolution of 1789 had as one of its slogans, "Ni Dieu ni maître," neither God nor master. And so here we are as individuals with possessions, and now we have rights of property. Rights are things which belong to individuals, prerogatives possessed independently of any other person. Because what is sovereignty worth if it's not about independence? Oh, sorry, that's too much of a political comment in advance of a general election. You see, if we conceive of our rights as possessions owned by individuals, as things which belong to me, then we come to think of ourselves as autonomous, unencumbered individuals whose primary self-expression is through exerting power over things which belong to us. Now, the result is a litigious and conflict-ridden society. I want this, you want that, I want this, you want... How do we frame those claims? Frame them in terms of rights. And suddenly they become zero-sum games. I win, you lose. Instead of negotiating compromise. Now, God has given human beings freedom. In the parable of the prodigal son, the son wants to be autonomous. He doesn't want to have to comply with any of his father's rules. Living on his own terms leads to disaster. The father doesn't take away the son's autonomy. He respects it. He waits for the son to return to him. The writer of 2 Peter 3:9 explains the delay in the arrival of the second coming and the last judgment in the following terms. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. We are not autonomous, however much we feel we are. We're not there, as Kant wanted, to come up with the law for ourselves. We are answerable to God for how we've treated one another and how we have responded to God's love. So the modern concept of rights has this idea of property at its heart. This property is conceived of as something belonging to individuals, and it then gives rise to this kind of core idea of autonomy. And that core idea of autonomy is then to be expressed through the way that we exercise our choices. Now, human rights theory arose in the aftermath of the Second World War as a response to the way in which Nazism and Stalinism had treated people as disposable instruments of the regime's will. So where the power of the state had been too great and the dignity of the individual had been overridden, you saw an emphasis now on individuals. But the temptation for human rights theory is to assert individual choice and immunity from critique over vast areas of life. John Perry argues that Locke was instrumental in the creation of a theory of rights in a world where not just particular understandings of Christian doctrine, but also conceptions of the good itself were simply a matter of individual taste. So rights theory develops as a response to a loss of belief in objective good and in the face of disagreement about what is good for human beings. And Earl Levine explains how in the next century that idea of choice gains importance in the thought of Thomas Paine. For Paine, the natural equality of all human beings translates to complete political equality and therefore a right to self-determination. The formation of society itself is a choice made by free individuals. So natural rights that people bring with them into society are rights to act as one chooses, free from coercion. Which came first, society or rights? Paine's answer to that question is really simple. Rights come first, then society. Society is something we opt into to the extent that we find it useful for the pursuit of our rights. It's not something that is there and constitutes our identity. So this, on Paine's view, leads to politics as an arena for the exercise of choice, where our only real obligations are to respect the freedom and the choices of others. So it's my rights that matter, never mind the cost to the community of satisfying them. It's my rights that matter, never mind the fact I have obligations to others. At the start of the 21st century, contemporary European culture has given pride of place in the idolatrous pantheon to a new god, the idol of choice. Bob Goodwatts identified the post-war generation as materialists who chose belongings over belonging. Now, we are in a different cultural phase, where it is ownership of self expressed as freedom of choice, rather than either belongings or belonging to and with others, which is highly prized. Now, the logic of this drives us towards a situation where there is no value at all other than choice. To go back to my example of the coffee. Coffee isn't inherently good. What matters is that I have chosen this. That's where all the value is to be located. Freedom, conceived of as the perfect, unconstrained spontaneity of individual will, is its own justification, its own highest standard, its own unquestionable truth. And therefore, to criticize another's choices is to challenge the ultimate value in our civilization. It is, in the words of J.K. Rowling, the kind of unforgivable curse. It's the unforgivable sin to be intolerant and judgmental. By contrast to the modern conception of rights, in which things have value only because they are chosen, the biblical picture from the book of Genesis onwards is that there is an objective moral order, a world in which some things really are good for human beings and other things really are bad for human beings. As the Jewish philosopher Michael Sandel puts it, justice is not only about the right way to distribute things, it's about the right way to value things. Put that another way, justice is about the right value to ascribe to things. Augustine would have said, or acting justly involves knowing what to love, and how much to love different things. And that means looking at the world out there and recognizing the things that are really good and valuing them and ordering one's loves appropriately. Which takes us then to the idea of equality. I mentioned the idea of equality previously. Let me unpack it a little more for us. The idea that men and women are of fundamentally equal worth finds its way into human rights theory through the ideas of John Locke. Central to his theories of natural rights, toleration, and liberal democracy, which have been so influential in the West today, was the assertion that all human beings, both men and women, are of fundamentally equal worth. Now, here is the shocking thing for the secularist. Insofar as anything is universally agreed about Locke, it is this. He does not present a single argument for equality that doesn't depend on Christianity. I'm familiar with what you can do with Aquinas, where you can strip out all the Bible stuff and you can say, well, there's some arguments to the left that look a lot like Aristotle. You just can't do it with Locke on equality. If you strip out all the Bible in Locke on equality, you have no arguments left. New Zealand philosopher Jeremy Waldron, in his book God, Locke and Equality, says Locke's commitment to fundamental human equality depends on Locke's Christianity, on Locke's belief in God. And as we've seen before, it depends on this idea that human beings are created by God. And for Christianity, because we believe that human beings were created by a good God, all human beings, however evil some of their actions may be, have an essential, indelible goodness that other human beings must recognize. Secondly, Christianity, in common with Judaism, says that human beings were made in God's image. Sorts of different theories about what that might mean, but at its heart is the idea that human beings have a relationship with God, which is different from the relationship other species of animals have, or at least other species of animals are on this planet. I think Christian thinkers in the realm of science fiction are quite rightly agnostic about whatever might be going on elsewhere in the universe. Thirdly, Christianity's founder was Jesus Christ, who went out of his way, as we saw in our first lecture, to identify with the vulnerable and the despised, and who offers the promise and hope of a relationship with God to anyone. So, 5 features then of the modern conception of rights: property, individualism, autonomy, choice, and equality. And you can see how, as I've already been through, Christianity would want to say, well, we need to re-examine and reinterpret and re-understand those issues. What's the heart of the Old Testament's moral teaching? The 10 Commandments. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? It's not the declaration of the rights of the Israelites. Now, you can do it if you want to. You can flip them and you can say, okay, I have a right that you don't sleep with my wife. I have a right that you don't try and nick my stuff. I have a right that you don't kill me. I actually have a right that you don't even think about doing any of those things. You can do it as well with the first table of commandments. God has a right to be worshipped. Everyone has a right to a day of rest. God has a right that he's worshipped in a way that doesn't involve the use of, you can do it. The one that's tricky, actually, is the do not bear false witness. You need to do a bit of work in order to turn that one round into a right, but you can do it. But given that you could express this as the declaration of the rights of the Israelite, why doesn't God do it? Well, the parents amongst you might know the answer to this. It's not fair. That's mine are not concepts that one has to spend hours teaching one's children. They usually, particularly if you've got 2 of them, grasp these concepts sort of naturally. You've had enough time on the tricycle. You need to share. Those are the things that we need to teach. And actually, Jesus in the New Testament, his teaching, the Sermon on the Mount is basically him showing off what a great rabbi he is, being able to interpret the Ten Commandments. So he's looking at the Ten Commandments, explaining what they really mean. And because he's such a virtuoso, he does it backwards. He starts at number 10 and works his way back through them. But he formulates the golden rule, again, as a proactive standard. Not do unto others as they have already done to you. Not get your own back. But do unto others as you would wish them to do to you. So this means that it is responsibilities that have a certain priority over rights. Now, the dominance of human rights theory in English language culture comes because our idea of rights comes from Locke. I've debated and discussed about human rights in various different contexts around Europe and elsewhere. And there's another tradition of rights theory, which puts duties at the centre. It's the idea of duties that was central to Hugo Grotius's thinking. For him, the main fundamental principle of natural law is the obligation to give to others what is due to them. So he says the underpinning of natural law is obligation, and that obligation then spins into rights on the part of those others to compel that duty to be performed. Samuel Pufendorf was a German who taught in Sweden, and he entitled his great natural law theory on the duties of man as citizen. Responsibilities rather than rights are key to a Christian understanding and a Christian conception. And that makes quite a big difference when you are then coming to think about how we deal with clashes of rights. French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. If each of the human rights were by its nature absolutely unconditional and exclusive of any limitation like a divine attribute, obviously any conflict between them would be irreconcilable. But who does not know in reality that these rights, being human, are like everything human, subject to conditioning and limitation? Right, he thought the answer to that was everybody knows that they're subject to conditioning and limitation, but in the 60 or 70 years since he wrote that, that has been lost. The various rights ascribed to the human being limit one another. And if we start with responsibilities, actually some of the disputes that rights theory on its own may create become solvable. So if I have the right to sit outside in my garden and read philosophy on a Saturday afternoon, and my next door neighbour has a right to have a party and a barbecue on a Saturday afternoon and play some loud reggae music or whatever, if we conceive of that in terms of a clash of rights, it's very difficult to see a solution. If we understand the responsibility that we have as good neighbours towards one another, then we can get into kind of negotiated settlement where he comes around and tells me we're going to have a barbecue tomorrow, and I say, great, thank you very much for letting me know I'm going out to the cafe. Or I go around and I say, do you know what, I'm working on the final stages of my thesis at the moment. Could you postpone your barbecue by a couple of weeks till after my deadline? And conceived of in terms of responsibilities, those things are easier to negotiate. Second difference between the way a Christian thinking about rights might compare to secular thinking or the modern conception is the good, the idea of good. You see, rights theory tries to get away from the idea of good. So the things that would be described as good and bad now become things described in terms of rights. And when we try to invoke rights without a corresponding theory of the good, then we really do run into the buffers when we're trying to sort out what should be given priority, what sort of balance ought to be struck. The impasse into which such an approach leads were brilliantly pinpointed by Michael Sandel in his book Justice. You can find his Harvard lectures on YouTube. He does it very well. He does far less talking than I would be doing. By asking questions, he teases out things. But what he concludes is this: justice is inescapably judgmental. So this idea that using the idea of rights, we can kind of create a space for tolerance without ever having to evaluate whether anything is good or bad or what kind of good it is bunk. So if we are thinking about the appropriate level of taxation for Amazon, we have to talk about what human flourishing looks like. And we have to talk about whether we take a kind of Nietzschean view that the excellencies which Jeff Bezos is able to achieve as an individual justify Amazon not having any taxation at all. Or whether actually what is good is what's good for most people, and therefore requires Amazon to pay a different and higher level of tax in the various countries in which it operates. If we're talking about surrogate motherhood and what rules we ought to have surrounding that, we have to get to grips with what are the goods, the distinctive goods involved in motherhood and parenting, and what happens when you say that one person is going to carry the child and another set of people are going to bring the child up. Questions of justice are bound up with competing notions of honour and virtue, pride and recognition. In my context, dealing with claims against banks, should the state bail out banks? Well, to answer that question, you have to ask, what are banks for? What goods do banks pursue? Once you've answered that question, you can then say, well, these institutions we call banks, to what extent do they actually pursue those goods? And to what extent are they just gambling on the markets? And once you've answered that question, then you can move on and get to grips with, should we be bailing them out? And if so, for what activities and to what extent? If you do it just in terms of property rights, you get lost. Because ironically, if ever there was an area where the theory of shareholder value doesn't work, it's in relation to banks, which are at the heart of the economy. Whether universities should be private or public, you need to know what the goods of education are. You have to grapple with these ideas. So when we bring responsibilities into the picture, and when we bring the idea of good into the picture, then we end up with a quite different set of ways of thinking about what rights are about. So you've got on the right there how the modern conception of rights is leading us to a freedom to choose, which is conceived in a series of freedoms from. Freedom from the claims of God. No God, the French Revolution say. Freedom from duties to our country and to one another. Thomas Paine, each man is a proprietor, drawing on capital out of right. No kind of sense of obligations to previous generations or obligations to future generations. Slightly problematic and likely to be inadequate as a response to the climate crisis. And then that's moving on now, it seems, to a freedom from the obligations of family life. You know, Locke's picture is a kind of picture in which our relationships are external to us, so we can pick them up and put them down when we want to. Don't commit, always be free to choose, give yourself an exit route, don't tie yourself down. What does that translate to? It translates to a falling marriage rate. And a falling marriage rate translates to a higher rate of couples breaking up, because one of the things that marriage seems to do is make it more likely that people will stay together in the long term. And now what we're seeing is a freedom from the obligations, the constraints, the restrictions of biology. I'm not going to get into transgenderism, but you could see that as an example of it. An even starker one was, did you see the one about the Dutch guy who went to court to try and get his age changed? He said, I don't feel 80, I feel 50, and having my biological age recorded is affecting my ability to get likes on dating websites. So my right to a relationship is being affected by this biological thing called age, and it's just a construct. So it could be set up differently. And I'm going to see all sorts of areas in which the claims of biology, the constraints there are being pushed and challenged in the century to come. Christianity had a lot to do with the rise of rights theory. Pufendorf, Grotius, Locke would all have seen themselves as Christians. Paine represents the decisive change. But as this idea of natural rights developed, it was a freedom for positive things. The sincere worship of God. You see, Locke, as a Christian, understood that what God is interested in is what happens on the inside. That simply turning up and sitting in a building and mouthing words that you don't believe is not what God wants. And therefore, his conclusion was that religious compulsion was ineffective because it didn't produce genuine belief. And therefore, there ought to be a right for people to worship God sincerely and in the way that they saw best. Now, that's a question actually partly about allocation of responsibility. What's the just allocation of responsibility? Is it the responsibility of the ruler to make sure that everybody in the country goes through the right sort of rituals? Or actually does it devolve down to households and beyond? Freedom to live in peace and security. So you've got Paul talking about rulers in Romans 13 being there to do you good and not bearing the sword for nothing. But the sword is there, it's force that is there to prevent the unrestrained violence that might otherwise occur. And it's freedom for involvement in and service in the common life. Allowing people access to the resources that they need in order to be able to take part in society as dignified members of the community. And then freedom to raise a family, freedom to enjoy rewarding and productive work. Well, you can get all of that actually, or most of that, out of Genesis, the early chapters of Genesis. The early chapters of Genesis, you can see God giving people life, and God giving people freedom, and God giving people dignity, and God giving people the capacity to engage in meaningful relationships and in rewarding work. So a Christian conception of rights looks at things and says, these things are good. These things are given by God, and therefore they ought to be respected. And we have a responsibility towards one another to enable others to flourish. So 2 different pictures, 2 different ways of thinking about rights. Christian story of God who gave us good gifts in creation, who gave the people of Israel the 10 Commandments as part of his providence, who's come to redeem us, and he promises us future hope, coming and shaping what is going to be a good society in which human beings flourish, where we are free to cooperate with one another rather than to be bashing up against one another in pursuit of our own interests.